Okay, so our next speaker is Chris Eppstein. He's the creator of the Compass CSS framework, and he's one of the core maintainers of Sass. And today he's going to talk about Sass and the Rails asset pipeline that's new in Rails 3.1. So thank you, Chris.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm here to talk to you about the future of Stylesheets, which is definitely Sass, and especially in Rails. So who am I? I'm Christopher Eppstein, and I blog on GitHub, and you can come and check out my articles and whatnot that I write, mostly about Sass and Compass, but usually some other stuff too. I tweet. And I work for caring.com. It's a website for people who are taking care of their sick or elderly loved ones. We might be hiring if you're interested, so let me know. I work on the Sass core team and help invent lots of cool features for Sass. I created Compass. So why am I here? Because I love Ruby on Rails, but I don't really understand why it stops at making HTML. And so when I first started using Rails, not too long after I found Sass, of course it now does support a little bit more than just HTML. So, and I've always hated CSS. Does anybody here like CSS? You're wrong. I don't know about you, but maybe lots of people know what it stands for, but I think they're wrong. It actually stands for consistently shitty style sheets. It's not even really that great at design. And when you see some of the features of Sass, or if you've used it, I think you'll start to understand why I think that. I love Sass. It just makes my life so much easier. It stands for syntactically awesome style sheets. And it's not capitalized. Deal with it. If you have problems with it, take it up with him. When I started using Sass, though it was at 2.0, and it was pretty primitive. It had mix-ins, but they didn't take arguments or anything like that. So then I started making Compass, and over the last few years, it has really evolved into the standard library for design. And I love this project, not just because I made it, but sometimes, sometimes somebody just kind of gets lucky, and they meet some great partners, and everything turns out better than expected. For instance, a crazy guy once met my wife, and we have an adorable daughter now. So, if there's anybody here that doesn't know about Sass syntax, like what it does, things like that? Okay, you're probably not the only one. But I'm not going to talk about that today, so just real quick, some of the things that it does. It gives us some variables. It gives us calculations, selector inheritance, mix-ins, some really cool features that give us the ability to create abstractions in our style sheets. If you've been using CSS, the only kind of abstraction that exists is the class. And so what happens is it all just compiles down to standard CSS so browsers can use it. But I'm here to talk to you today about the asset pipeline and how Sass integrates with that and how you can use it in your Rails applications. So assets go in to the asset pipeline, and assets come out. And unfortunately, Bill, I'm going to try to explain it. But here's the thing I want to say about the asset pipeline. It's a bit rough around the edges, and I really consider it kind of the minimum viable product for the asset pipeline concept. And the vision of the asset pipeline is really great, and if you're frustrated with it, that's okay, because as a community, what we all need to do is rally behind this concept. you need to file bugs, you need to talk about your problems with it, and maybe make plugins for it, and things like that. Make feature requests. Whatever it is, like, but this is going to be a great thing someday, so stick with us. The basic concept behind the asset pipeline is the ability to transform, rename, and generate our static assets, taking them from source and putting them into production. But static assets really just aren't so simple after all. For instance, it's a common best practice to concatenate and compress your JavaScript and your CSS files. So you need to do some steps here, and it's really great that Rails is finally embracing that. So in your Rails root directory, app assets, this is where you'll put things like images, style sheets, JavaScript, etc. And the pipeline is going to move them into public assets. And it's going to do that when you do a precompile step. It also will virtually do that when you access those URLs if they haven't been generated yet. If you've been using Rails for a long time, then you know that assets have these little cache timestamps, and that they can cause problems with CDNs and things like that, reverse proxies, etc. But they're generally not as well behaved when you put these query strings on as a standard resource is. And in Ruby on Rails, like, we know resources really, really well. And so it's important, I think, that we're finally treating our assets like real resources. So basically, the concept here is that you're going to run rake assets precompile, and the things on the left, neatly organized, will turn into the junk drawer on the right. So if you've so it adds this. It becomes minimized when you compile it. You get like your CSS files and your JavaScript files will be minimized, and you'll also get a compressed version of the same style sheet. To use the compressed version, you're going to need to do some web server configuration to tell it how to route to that file when the appropriate headers come in. You'll notice that there's a lot of digits added onto these digests. Personal opinion, it's a bit extreme. I think maybe 8 or so would be quite sufficient, and a lot of extra bytes to throw over the wire. And by default, Rails is only going to compile your application.css and your application.js. So you need to make sure that you have listed any other files that you want it to compile during pre-compilation in your app configuration. You might even want to do some globbing here or something else like that, according to some convention. But these digests are actually awesome. They really make our apps well behaved, and they allow us to use really long TTLs in terms of caching, and they're going to work well with CDNs if you use something like that. But the problem with it is if you use CSS, they're a total pain in the ass. And so you can do something like this. You can throw some ERB into your CSS files. But the bottom line is asset helpers are not optional anymore, even in your style sheets or in your JavaScripts. But if you're using SCSS, you have a syntax-aware parser, and so you can actually just use this image URL helper that exists. Similar helpers exist for fonts and JavaScripts and all kinds of other things like that. You can also chain a whole bunch of processors together. They'll be processed from right to left. I don't know why you would want to do this. So far, everybody who's told me that they needed to combine ERB with CSS or with SCSS was mistaken. But if you think you have a valid use case, please do let us know, because that's probably a feature that we need to add. So how do we set up a new project? Well, we need to say Rails, new, my project, and part of the things that get created are assets. But they're not very sassy. So I don't really understand why this happens this way, because we're including Sass by default, but you get a CSS file is your main thing. Maybe we'll get a fix for that. But right now it's a little rough around the edges. So what I suggest that you do is that you start off by renaming your application CSS to application CSS.SCSS, and change require self, require tree to import star. So I want to talk to you a little bit about Sprockets and Sass and the different directives that they provide. But the long story short is you don't need to use the Sprockets directives if you're using SCSS. They're just there for people who want to stay with CSS. So the Sprockets directives are basically, you put them in a comment, you start them with an equal sign, and you can do require self, which I'm going to come back to actually. It usually shows up first in the source file. So you can say require something like admin, and that's just another file that's relative to this file. It might be absolute. Sorry, I'm not entirely sure because I don't really use it. But basically what happens is it goes out, it finds that on the assets path. You can actually have lots of different directories with assets in them, and then it processes it into the correct type, so in this case CSS, and then drops the result right into the file. By default, requires are added to the top of the file. And so the existence of require self is so in the case where you want to put the contents of your current file above the imported dependencies. Require tree is kind of the same thing as require a single file, except it's going to grab recursively an entire folder of CSS files and concatenate them all together for you. And there's a fourth directive called depend on, and what it basically does is it just signals that if that file were to change that you're depending on, then it should invalidate the file that you're in. The important thing to note here is that if you do this in your SCSS files, any variables or mix-ins that you had defined there will not be available in your SCSS file because it's already been transformed into CSS, which is why instead you should use Sass directives. We did a huge refactoring to Sass to allow us to make this import statements in Sass actually go out and talk to some external concepts and return back the files. And as a side effect of that effort, you can do things like store your style sheets in a database, fetch them, and then generate the results, or whatever other crazy ideas you can come up with. Maybe fetch them off the internet and download them and depend on them without having to install them locally. But the bottom line is in Rails, you can basically pass, like in admin, you say import admin, it'll find it and put the result. We don't have the concept of require self because the import statement puts the imported file wherever you put the import statement, which seems pretty obvious. And if you're a Sass user right now, you might be wondering, where do these lobs come from? Because Sass doesn't allow it. So that's part of the Rails importer. And it allows you to match anything that a Ruby lob could match and import it. You need to be really careful with this. I've already had it bite me, and that's one of the reasons we've been adamant against it. Basically, CSS is so order dependent that if you do this too much, you really stand a chance of ending up having this cascade change on you, and then you're like, why isn't this working? the assets group in your gem file is where you should put any gems related to the asset pipeline. So for instance, when you first get your application, it'll have Sass Rails, which has a dependency on Sass and provides all of the integration code between Sass and Rails. Copy Rails, Uglifier, and you should definitely put Compass in here. If you have a cap file, you're going to need to add load deploy assets to it so that during your deployment, it's going to call rake assets precompile. So what was the point again? Well, mainly we wanted to provide better syntax and really great caching support and make our assets great. But if you can think back to DHH's keynote back in RailsConf 2010, really the point was sprites are a pain in the ass. And they were really looking for a way to make sprites so much easier. But at least the hair looks good. So I went and joined forces with a Compass plugin called Lemonade. And Lemonade was the best of breed spriting solution for Compass at the time. And then worked really closely with him to integrate that with our project. But we made serious API changes to it along the way. So if you were using Lemonade, basically it's deprecated, it doesn't exist anymore, and we have a new API. There's a ton of docs on our website where you can learn all about the asset capabilities, and it's super powerful. And so I wanted to give you a demo of that and show you kind of what you can do with this cool feature. Too big. You guys read that all right?
You don't have the left.
What's that? Cut off on there? On the left. All right, there we go. Cool, so right here I have a pretty simple Rails app that I made. And so nothing too exciting going on here, I'll just show you real quick. That I have in assets, Stylesheets, application. What I would consider to be some pretty typical SCSS code. And so here you can see that we've created a bunch of icons, and we're just referencing them in as our background image. We're setting up some heights and whatnot, and let me show you what it looks like. All right, so just real simple stuff, and if we come in here and inspect this element, we'll see that we've just got a background image that's pointing at the file. And so we had to go and get 5 files in this case in order to display this, and that's really inefficient. We can certainly do better. We're Rubyists. So let's do it, let's change it. So the first thing we have to do is go to our gem file, and we have to add Compass. Now we go back to our style sheet. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to import our sprites. And so what's happening in this case is kind of the Sass equivalent of metaprogramming. That importer system that I showed you earlier, where we could go off and do blobbing or find assets via the asset pipeline, also enables us to generate imports on the fly based on maybe things that we find on our file system. And so what this directive does is it tells us to go into our icon directory in our images folder and find all of the images and generate a style sheet based on those. And it looks pretty complicated, and that's why you wouldn't want to do it yourself, and it's because it's very configurable. And so you can see it by typing, oops, I should use the other term. Sorry, I'm an advisor addict. Bundle, exec, compass, right? Icon, star.png. And so what Compass did in this case is it generated that same file that you're going to import. You might get a small performance improvement if you do this. You can also do that and then go in and edit it to optimize the file a little bit. So just to give you a quick view of what we actually generate when we do an import. There's all these configuration variables, but we give you a bunch of mixins. And these are all documented on our website, but sometimes it's just really nice to go in and see them and feel them and touch them. And so you can see how you can include a sprite with its dimensions. You can get its put its position somewhere, things like that. So coming back, what we're going to do is use one of those mixins that gets generated. Back to our web browser. We reload the page, and it still looks great. But let's see what happened. So now instead of seeing a background image on each of these elements, we've got a background position. And make this a little bit taller. You'll see that what we have here is a background image that's our sprite. So we put it all together for us, concatenated them, and now and since Compass knows where it put them, it can place them onto and set your background positions accordingly. You can applaud. Because now your designer doesn't have to do it, and now you don't have to bug them, they just leave them. It's just so awesome. So a few other cool things that we can do with this. Like this was if you wanted to get really tweaky with your selectors, and you already maybe had some existing stuff and you wanted to bring it in to an existing style sheet. But what if you didn't want to do that? We can make it even easier for you if you follow our conventions. So we provide a mixin called all icon sprites. So you guys get that there's a convention here, right, between the mixin names and the folder, right? Like because it was the icon folder, it's all icon sprites. If it had been action, and then that would be all action sprites. And now, so what this is going to do is it gives us class names that we can rely on that you don't even see in this generated file. But we have to change our markup a little bit. So because we can have namespace conflicts between different icon sets or sprite sets, you need to add a little prefix here. There we go. And we reload our page. And voila. I just also really just wanted to show you how the CSS that we generate looks, because it's basically as good as hand-coded CSS. Using the Sass extend directive, we've been able to share the base image URL across all of these classes. And then when we inherit from those, all it changes is the background position. So this is hand-optimized code for you guys. And that's it. I have time for just a couple of questions. Before I do that, I wanted to mention one more thing. We have some links on here just for if you guys are doing that. But also, Compass is charityware. And so if you use it and it makes your life easier, we just ask that you donate whatever you can afford to the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation. This is the charity that is looking for a cure for my father's disease.
You, in the beginning of your presentation, mentioned, I think, depend on or depends on, which is an asset pipeline declaration. Does the Sass, Rails Sass gem automatically do that if you put an image URL, if you use the helper in a style sheet? That is, will my style sheet automatically expire?
It should. And if it doesn't, that would be a bug, but I'm pretty sure we do that. I know we do it when we generate the sprites and stuff, we go through and there it goes.
The image helpers that you had in Sass, the image path one, do those respect the Rails asset host or support realization of subdomains?
They do.
Fantastic.
And also if you run precompile, it'll know where you should put the digest on there and all that.
Anyone else?
There's one.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the compressing all of the images. Does that have, I'm assuming, sensible compression defaults, or how does it, assure that the image that it generates isn't gigantic if a huge file sneaks into that?
Good question. So actually, Compass has 4 different layout systems that it can use: horizontal, vertical, diagonal, and smart, and it'll generate different dimensions, and they have different memory and file size characteristics. So you can. That's one of the ways we provide to tune that. The other thing that and they also have different layout concerns. So one might work better for what you're trying to do with those. And we use chunky PNG, which is a Ruby library for doing PNG manipulation. If you can, install oily PNG, which is a C extension that makes it even faster. And if it's still not compressed enough for you, we can't really include what's that PNG output? Sorry, I'll tweet about it in a second. But there's callbacks in your Compass configuration file if you choose to make those. You can also access those in your Rails config. So you can run arbitrary code when we generate a sprite and go through and compress it even further down if you want to.
Do you have any, more of a question rephrased, how would you say to use extend versus mixin? Would you go as far as say only use mixins if you're taking parameters?
Well, definitely you can't take parameters to an extent, so that's one of the key differences. Basically, my way I think about it is extend works with the cascade of your document. So if you need the overrides of your style sheet cascade, definitely use extend. It'll work a lot nicer with that, and it really embraces kind of CSS's basic principles. Mixins kind of throw those by the wayside, and if you're having cascade issues, a mixin is like a blunt hammer. You can just like use these styles right here, and you don't have to worry about the cascade anymore. Of course, it's really a balance of file size, so you have to be careful how you do it. I use extend at least as much as I use mixins.
That's all we got time for. Thank you very much, Chris.